All right, so we are just coming up on 11 o'clock here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I know I've got all my panelists here. I do want to remind everybody in the audience, please turn off your microphone and your camera. Maybe later on we'll ask for questions verbally, but for the moment, let's turn those off. All right, so again, I want to welcome everybody to the Georgia Department of Transportation and the Georgia Transportation Institute panel on vulnerable road users. This is an exciting session. This is our kickoff of the research week. And as a reminder, as part of that, if you want to slip to the next slide there, Sfara. The other couple things going on here would also be this coming Monday will be the 12th Annual Research Expo, and that is in person. So if you could make it, that'd be fantastic. That will be on Monday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. at 1 Georgia Center on the 4th floor. It'll be a collection of posters. It's always a great time, exciting time, and you can meet a lot of the research PIs, the folks actually doing the work. You get this opportunity to have some one-on-one interactions. A lot of the folks who actually sponsor the research at GDOT and the technical contacts and the people who really like bring this alive and help us with all the implementation will be there. So we're really thankful for all the folks who can show up. So I really encourage you to come and see what's going on in research. And as a reminder to the faculty and GDOT folks, the 2024 research needs statement is currently active. So this is when a lot of the research is determined that will go on over the next year. This is the period. So that is active from September. It started in September and it goes through October 9th. You can see the link below the Research Expo-GDOT Hub, arcgis.com. That's the link to get you to everything. If you should have hopefully seen a bunch of emails on this. If you have not, it's there. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the GDOT research staff. And if you're not sure who there to reach out to, go ahead if you want to send me an email and I will also get you to the right person. So a lot of big things going on and we're kicking it off all today with a panel. All right, fantastic. So my name is Michael Hunter, which I never said. I will be moderating this session today. I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering. Our panel, we're very excited. We have Andrew Heath, Ron Giminovich, which I've mispronounced. I apologize, Ron. I've only known you for 5 years. Randy Ginsler, and Caitlin Schaefer. Andrew is the Deputy Chief Engineer for GDOT over the divisions of engineering, intermodal, and operations. In this role, he leads 3 divisions of the department, handling a broad range of responsibilities across project, pre-construction, and rotary operations into other critical programs, including transit, rail, and aviation. Ron is the State Safety Engineering Supervisor at GDOT, where he leverages innovative and proactive approaches to reduce highway fatalities in Georgia. Sorry, I do not read out loud well. He oversees the state road safety audits, is the task team leader for pedestrian and bicycle task teams, is a coordinator for GDOT Safe Routes to Schools program, and is a co-chair. And co-chairs the GDOT Safety Research Technical Advisory Group. Randy Ginsler is a professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Georgia Institute of Technology. He's currently working with GDOT and the ARC and a host of regional partners on federally funded ITS Georgia project. And the forthcoming Georgia Mobility and Accessibility Planner, GMAP, will provide preferred routes for a variety of mobility modes. Randy, I know you had more in your bio, but I'll let you do that later. Caitlin Schaefer is a senior engineer at Kittleson Associates in Baltimore and a graduate of Georgia Tech. Woohoo! Her work focuses on advancing safe and equitable transportation solutions for all modes of transportation. Caitlin specializes in micromobility programming, Vision Zero planning, research on ped bike, policy development, and complete streets design. I very much appreciate Caitlin for showing up. I do apologize. I know I caught you last minute. I was reading your report you did on separated bike facilities, actually last week, and I could not find your email until very recently, until somebody said, Mike, just look on LinkedIn, and that's how you find her. And then you responded in about 5 minutes, so that's totally on me. I apologize for not getting to you sooner. But let's jump into it. Okay, so for the panel, as we get started, I think the place I'd like to start, I've just done a really quick background, but if we could hear a little bit more about maybe your background or really you're interested in vulnerable road users and maybe some of the work you see in that space. We can We'll go in the order I introduced, I guess. Andrew, do you want to go first?
Sure, Mike. Thank you. And first and foremost, just Mike, want to thank you for helping pull this panel together, helping pull this off. I want to thank GTI and our research team. It's always great that annually we can do an event like this and kind of kick it off with a panel, and looking forward to everything next week. And, as we were talking about sort of what do we want to talk about as a panel, we quickly sort of coalesced around vulnerable road user safety because, it is such a critical thing, and it's a real challenge that we face here in Georgia. Our recent trends in terms of safety have not been great. And particularly as you isolate vulnerable road user safety, it really stands out as moving in the wrong direction. So having this discussion, talking about the things that we're doing, how the research community, how industry can help us tackle this challenge is obviously critically important. My background, I'm a civil engineer, but within the department, I spent about 7 years over in the traffic operations office as state traffic engineer. One of the core programs that traffic operations manages is the federal aid highway safety improvement program. So dollars directly allocated via formula by the federal government to state DOTs. And the HSIP, or Highway Safety Improvement Program, is specifically targeted towards addressing critical safety issues on the infrastructure within the state. So as we look as to what's happening from a safety perspective, safety issues, as I mentioned, vulnerable road user safety has really become elevated as a core issue. That pushes investment in our part through the HSIP program to try to tackle those issues. So in working with traffic operations and the staff in traffic operations like Ron, who does this from a day-to-day perspective, it's all about developing and delivering infrastructure that's going to improve that safety story. And then personally, I am an avid runner and avid bicyclist. So a lot of these issues are near and dear to my heart because as I run and as I cycle, I want to be safe too. So that's a little bit of my background. So I will turn it over to Ron.
Cool. Hey guys, so I'm a graduate at Georgia Tech about 4 years ago now, and or at least undergrad. And I particularly fond of vulnerable roadway user safety. I started as the state pedestrian and bicycle engineer at GDOT, and kind of progressed up to safety in general. But ped bike safety is becoming an increasing priority within the agency, and it's just because the numbers are showing that direction. But the kind of problem with vulnerable roadway user safety in our current practices is we're dealing with limited data. VRU crashes or ped and bike crashes represent less than 1% of our total crash data, but about 20% of our fatalities. And it's really difficult to make engineering decisions off, say, one data point. So we really need to be expanding our data sets that we utilize for vulnerable roadway user safety. And that's kind of where I like to bring a lot of the data science I learned at Georgia Tech and all those data-driven practices. It's kind of, maybe it's more advanced data analysis, but allows us to be data-driven, still try to improve vulnerable roadway user safety proactively rather than dealing with only that crash data that we traditionally have done.
All right. Randy?
I think you're muted, Dr. Gensler.
Yeah, you'd think with all the online instruction we've done that we'd have that down, right? Nope. So my background here at Georgia Tech has been a lot in vehicle activity monitoring and looking at the traffic patterns and how that affects energy use and emissions. Over the last 10 years, we started taking a much harder look at the pedestrian infrastructure and bike infrastructure, design issues, ADA requirements, and essentially looking at how the infrastructure could be affecting these travel patterns. So while I'm not involved in the safety statistical analysis, we're helping to provide a lot of the data with respect to the infrastructure that would be used. And like Ron said, we're dealing with a lack of data. We got a very difficult time to control both the understanding of how much activity is going on, what percentage of the crashes are actually reported, which is typically assumed to be only about half. And there's a lot more variability that affects the pedestrian death or a bicyclist death compared to what we typically see in the vehicle activity. So focus primarily on infrastructure assessment for design and condition.
All right, Caitlin?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I currently work at Kittleson as the senior engineer in their Baltimore office, but I was both an undergrad and graduate student at Georgia Tech, and enjoyed my time in Atlanta and living in Georgia very much. A lot of the work that I have focused on has been centered on bicycle and pedestrian safety. Um, It sounds like someone might be outside on their phone, but a lot of my work is focused on bicycle and pedestrian safety. As Dr. Hunter alluded to in the intro, I most recently worked on the FHWA guide for separated bike lanes on higher speed roads, which is an extension of the separated bike lanes design guidance, and it's focusing specifically on building out your network to include your higher speed roads and the vertical and horizontal separation that's required to keep people safe on those roads. But there's also a big emphasis on our network and how are we getting not just one specific facility, but how we're building out so people can get safely from one place to another. Um, Other work has focused a lot on the Safe Streets for All, both applying to a lot of grants and also helping develop safety action plans.
All right. Well, fantastic. Thank you to all of our panelists. I think the background is great. Sophia, Sphera, could you jump to the next slide? So I prepared a few questions in advance for our panelists to think about. And I want to encourage everybody in the audience, please go ahead and submit your questions on the chat. Given the number of people, it's going to be hard for us to do questions if people try to jump in on their mic. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And as they come in, I'll try to get them out to our panelists. So let's just start. I think we need to start at the beginning. I mean, how would you define a vulnerable road user or a VRU group? Caitlin, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. So I think first and foremost, when I think about vulnerable road users, I think just they're people. They're people that are using facilities and they're people that aren't necessarily driving or have the protection of a vehicle to keep them safe when using the roadway. There's a lot of people that make up our communities that don't have the option to drive or use a car, not only by choice, um, but just to complete essential trips. So that includes children, young people that don't have a license or means to purchase a vehicle, elderly people, and people that have disabilities that prevent them from operating a car.
Randy, Ron, Andrew, anybody want to add more on top?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Mike, a little bit. I mean, I'll echo everything that Caitlin said. You think about a vulnerable road user, you think about folks that are, using a bicycle, walking, rolling on some sort, micromobility, scooter. And if you take a look at Georgia DOT's published vulnerable road user assessment, safety assessment, which is a required document through.
I agree with everything that has been said. I think the other consideration I would add is just the high rate of distracted driving. Last week I was conducting a vehicle yield study at different types of crossing. And it quickly turned into making notes of who and who wasn't using a phone when crossing through the crosswalk. And I think it's really important just thinking about the devices we're using while operating a vehicle, but also what can we do with our roadways and our policies to make that less prevalent? And then just overall compliance. While it's everyone's responsibility to be a safe roadway user, I feel right now, just from my experience running and biking to work and things like that, that so much of the burden is put on vulnerable road users to keep themselves safe. Um, I see drivers rolling through stop signs or not yielding at crosswalks, and it's really on me to be checking for those types of things, making eye contact when I'm crossing the street. So designing roadways that make those behaviors less acceptable overall.
All right. Well, let me ask.
Mike, could I jump
Go
in
for it.
real quick?
Yeah.
I think Caitlin brings up a great point, sort of the relationship between driver behavior and roadway design, that in my experience or in my opinion, one of the hardest things to tackle is influencing driver behavior. You're talking about education campaigns, you're talking about working with enforcement, you're talking about outside of the infrastructure itself, outside of DOT, to say, okay, how can we influence what people are actually doing? And that's tough to do. Folks have these habits of pulling out their phone while they're driving. Getting that message across is very difficult. So in my opinion, influencing that is very difficult, and it becomes a personal thing for everybody, for everyone to do their part to try to limit the distractions that they have. With that being said, then that sort of points the finger at, okay, well, how do we then make the infrastructure work better to limit those activities, or limit those potential conflict points, limit those areas where safety issues become paramount, knowing that distraction is going to occur, right? So just the common thing, say installing an R-cut at a two-way stop control at a high-speed roadway, right? Distraction happens. You've got a situation where you could have a very severe incident with those conflict points that exist. Can we eliminate those conflicts, right? So even if distraction is going on, you're eliminating some of those really bad potential conflicts that can lead to some of these issues. So trying to make the infrastructure work a little bit better to keep VRUs a little bit safer, knowing that some of that behavior is going to be out there. We got to try to bring it down, but it's going to be there. So it's a great point.
So let me, I'm going to go off that for a second. I'm going to go off script for a minute, so don't change slides. When I was working on the panel, pulling it together, I asked several folks, hey, give me some sample questions. What do you think I should ask? And one of them that actually came up that I haven't put in here was the issue of vehicle design. And I haven't heard anybody in the panel mention that. So their specific issue would say vehicle size, right? The vehicles need to be smaller. And I would be curious, and sort of in response to that, we have industry is represented on the panel, academics is represented on the panel, and the state DOT is represented on the panel. Do any of our groups and the audience have anything to do with, or should we be seeking to have influence over vehicle design as well? Or is that sort of an outside category we can't do anything about?
I've got something there. So with the VRU safety assessments, if you went to Tier B, you could probably see 20 people present on things that came out of them. And the biggest thing I saw that came out was vehicle weight is a huge influencer of pedestrian severity. So we talk a lot about speed, but that vehicle weight is just as important. And with the emergence of electric vehicles and their extremely heavy weights and extremely high acceleration rates, it seems almost like 0 to 60 in a few seconds shouldn't be something to brag about with a several 100-pound vehicle. So that's something we do need to get into the space of, for sure. And it's so much data has been provided on the correlation between vehicle weight and the severity of those crashes when they do occur.
And Mike, I know we don't have anybody on this discussion in that space directly dealing with that space, but I mean that is foundational to the safe systems approach. Being pushed through Federal Highway and US DOT down to Georgia DOT, which we have adopted that approach. which includes safer vehicles. So working with, our partners at NHTSA on what they're doing from a vehicle safety perspective. Everything Ron and others have said is completely right. I mean, that's foundational to this entire equation. But then also what, the benefits of technology and what can technology bring. We can't hang our hat on it's going to solve everything. VRU safety, it's going to require that all-inclusive safe systems approach to tackle this issue. But we certainly need to be in a position to try to see some of those technologies, whether it be connectivity or automation or whatever that can provide those benefits, trying to work with those partners to see those things come to fruition. So.
And the modern technologies we have with the eyesight systems and automatic braking, they have to be playing a role.
Yeah,
it's already my car's already saved me once from an impact. So.
Yeah, and a suggestion from the chat is, are there roles for technology to help actually influence the driver behavior itself? So maybe we could have technology within the vehicles. I don't know if anybody's familiar with anything that's really trying to influence the behavior. Just what can we do? Maybe some ADAS, some advanced driver assistance systems, or these type of things as well.
I'll say passive detection, those brought up as well. Definitely something we're exploring for pedestrians and cyclists in particular. A lot of pedestrians don't press the push button, and rapid flashing beacons can be, I think there's some stat out there about 10 times more effective when the button is pushed versus when it's not pushed. So using passive detection in those types of environments could be very helpful. And that's really something we're getting into now because the reliability of that is critical for that infrastructure to be usable.
All right. So we'll jump to the next question. I want to make sure we don't run out of time. So Spark, you could jump down one. And this is a hard question, and I understand that. And I think I've asked it nicely here, but I can certainly make it a little harsher. It's difficult, right? How do we pay for this? And I think if we do look at all of the budgets at the state and local, county, city levels, the dollars really do overwhelmingly tend to go towards vehicle infrastructure versus the VRU infrastructure. And how do we revisit that, or how do we make sure we're dedicating resources in ways to really capture VRUs? And I know it's a tough one.
So I'll jump in here, Mike, and I'll sort of tackle it from two perspectives when you talk about resources. So first one, yeah, obviously funding, right? At Georgia DOT, I'm proud of the fact that we fully allocate our HSIP apportionment amounts from the federal government every year, and we overinvest in that program.
So for those who don't know what HSIP stands for?
Yeah, Highway Safety Improvement Program. Sorry about that, but
that's right.
We overinvest in that, so we make this a priority because we see the situation that we're in from a safety perspective. Now we've got to dedicate those infrastructure dollars to tackle this issue. The other thing too is that we include safety into all of our work, right? So all of our designs. We have adopted an intersection control evaluation policy as a department, which requires a look at all of our projects through the lens of safety, right? It doesn't dictate the design, but it informs the design to make sure we're taking that safety viewpoint into our design. But we can always do more. It's clearly an issue, so we need to continue to focus on that from a funding perspective. To really try to bring this down. The other thing I wanted to talk about was not just funding resources, but the resources of the infrastructure or the capacity of the roadway, right? How do we decide, hey, we're going to utilize some of our right-of-way or some of our roadway specifically to accommodate vulnerable road users rather than vehicles, right? A great example, that probably everyone's thinking about is a road diet project or a roadway reconfiguration project where you're taking away capacity of a roadway and reconfiguring it for other users. And we have done that. And I'm very proud of Ron, of Sam Harris, of the folks in traffic operations and maintenance and design policy and design across the department where we have delivered those projects, and we have made the very deliberate decision to say, look, we are going to make these accommodations on this roadway, knowing that there could be some level of operational degradation from a vehicle perspective. But we've got to have that real conversation about, are we striking the right balance? So a good example is the Memorial Drive corridor, where we've instituted a roadway reconfiguration project that spanned a number of years. And when you look at the safety story of that corridor, we were seeing an average of at least one fatality a year on that stretch of roadway. And these were primarily pedestrians, right? And as we looked at the operations of that roadway and we were having those conversations of, are we striking the right balance? We realized that through a reconfiguration project, one, we could dramatically improve that safety story. But two, we have the tools and the technologies available to maintain the operational nature for vehicles on that corridor as well, pushing the same volume, handling a similar capacity, but doing so in a much more uniform way at lower speed. That's safer. Establishing a much more uniform traffic flow, much less chaotic traffic flow, by providing the right infrastructure improvements in the right place, and reorienting the corridor a little bit to strike that more appropriate balance. So it's targeting those areas from the infrastructure where we can make those decisions, and having the drive to get those projects done. So, but it is a very difficult conversation sometimes.
Well, add a little bit from a program perspective, versus, I guess, Andrew, with the looking over several programs. Where our program in HSIP is required to do 15% of our budget towards vulnerable roadway user safety. So we're trying to exceed that as well, and trying to make that a priority to exceed that, because our fatalities are around 20%. So really want to get to match and kind of compensate for historically not hitting that threshold. But at the same time, we're also looking to aid other programs and trying to get VRU safety a part of all those projects. That Memorial Drive project Andrew mentioned is just one of many that we hope to have success stories on as well, where we're looking to get ped bike improvements and resurfacings that come up, where traditionally that money goes to vehicular safety improvements, but we're trying to get that VRU safety as well. And then we have a rural active transportation plan now, where one of the key things that we even put in the project scope of this plan was trying to find all the funding sources available to us for VRU safety and what qualifies. Carbon reduction qualifies for VRU safety. There's bridge projects that you can add a low VRU safety component to as well. Transportation alternatives programs, and really trying to find out how we can maximize our budget with that. And an emphasis on that VRU, rural facilities for VRUs with that rural active transportation plan, because those are often the places where the locals struggle the most to actually get their own funding for it.
So, Caitlin, I know you look at this from the consultant perspective, doing work for a lot of these agencies, and you're also doing a lot of outside of the state. I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of funding avenues and funding mechanisms and prioritization, I guess I would say, of VRU dollars outside of Georgia. And is there anything we can learn from that? Or maybe we're doing great and we can pat ourselves on the back, right? But is there something we can learn?
Yeah, for sure. It is extremely variable depending on the state. There's just a lot of great funding opportunities, and how those resources are distributed is really left up to the states in a lot of ways. I think one thing that I think a lot about, especially working a lot with Maryland Department of Transportation and other neighboring states, is thinking about the overarching policies you have in place that kind of guide your thinking of where the funding is. Something we've been working on right now with Maryland Department of Transportation is developing, well, we work to develop their new Complete Streets policy, and then the implementation of that policy, which of course comes with a lot of evaluating these trade-offs and distributing resources to achieve the policy component. Um, I think while we're talking about this question, I can't not mention NCHRP report 1036, which is the cross-section reallocation guide. And I think that's a resource that I really have enjoyed working with and pointing others to. So it basically establishes a framework through how to think through things like road diet, like how are you distributing your resources, but also distributing your physical space on the roadway for who's using it. And one of the things that comes up in that is rethinking how we evaluate capacity essentially, and thinking beyond your peak 15 minutes for the day and thinking of your day as a whole. And I know I get really in the weeds with things like ICE spreadsheets, which is intersection control evaluation tools, and getting in the details there. And like this alternative pops up as the best option for this location. But if you do some investigation into the other alternatives that are available for you, maybe just because it didn't rank the best in delay, like your second best might not be far behind, and it might have a lot of opportunities to incorporate some of these vulnerable road user accommodations and facilities we've been talking about.
And that was 1036?
Yes, I
All
believe
right.
so.
NCHRP report 1036. That sounds, I will get that. We're gonna at least make the class look at it.
Okay.
Mike, can I add the academic perspective here? Because we have our grad students look at this in the
Okay.
urban transportation planning course. So we asked the grad students to compare multiple plans from different transportation plans for different MPOs to look at how they're selecting and prioritizing and selecting projects. And there's a tremendous amount of variability across MPOs in terms of the dedication of resources by mode or to VRU groups. And I guess one of the big things to keep in mind is that some actually set aside dollars for bike and ped projects. And there may be a certain set aside based on the actual capital investment or on a percentage of projects. And the big question in my mind also is asking how they're spending their money on these projects and whether or not it's actually affecting bicycle capacity, pedestrian capacity, safety, accessibility, mobility, essentially. I remember Susan Handy did a study, it was quite a while ago, but looking at how transportation enhancement money was spent and finding that, there really is a big difference between how some were spending money back then on enhancements and others spending it on actual improvements that affect bike and ped users and VRUs. So I guess the other thing with that is that the metrics are all so different across these MPOs about how they're assessing the projects. Just along the line of what Caitlin was saying, some are pretty cut and dry and formulaic, and others are opinion-based, polling. So the metrics do matter in terms of how the money is allocated, and we should probably be thinking about what we're trying to accomplish with the allocation of the funds and getting those into the metrics.
Well, then let's jump to the next question. So far already, you've introduced the next question. It's almost like you knew what it was. So the next one, I think you went the wrong. Yeah, go down one. So I want to, Randy, I'll let you take on this because I think it's just where you went. But I also want to weave in. We've got some really great comments in the chat. And the idea here is, what are the performance metrics that we should be thinking about? We've obviously have heard a lot of fatalities, severe injury. Non-severe injury, we've looked at those aspects, but there, when thinking about performance metrics, there may also be other VRUs, heat exhaustion, right? Are we creating these issues? And also some interesting threads that I seem to be popping out on the chat when you talk about performance metrics, thinking about, are we potentially doing maybe some VRU mitigations that are helpful for one group, but not the other, right? Maybe this makes bicycling safer, but the pedestrians actually didn't get safer. The pedestrian gets safer, the bicycle. So are we seeing some trade-offs potentially even in safety? And I know we usually don't like the word trade-off, but so really think about what do we think about what performance metrics really matter beyond just fatality? And I know that's the critical matter, but what other, and also, are we potentially having to deal with the fact that helping one may not serve another well? Randy, you want to jump?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Randy.
Oh, sorry.
No, go.
Well, I was just going to say,
This is
just
crazy.
very quickly, that we have our federal performance metrics that date back to MAP 21, and that we report up to the feds, our partners at Federal Highway, on sort of how we're doing, those core metrics you talked about, Mike. But I'd love for Ron to get into the work he's doing around near miss analytics, and using data and technology to understand not just when crashes occur, but the potential for crashes, so we can turn that conversation around a little bit, be a little bit more proactive. Going back to the trade-off discussion, I mean, it's absolutely right. And I saw the chat around rumble strips, edgeline rumble strips, and are you making the situation worse for cyclists? We have, as Ron said, we've gotten a number of complaints on that exact issue. So understanding our rumble strip design, our rumble strip placement becomes critical for that. Again, it's striking that right balance. What are you trying to achieve, and then what are the outcomes or potential unintended outcomes of doing that? And do you have the necessary infrastructure to support it, right? So if you're going to put in edgeline rumble strips from a lane departure perspective, are you in a situation where you can also accommodate wider shoulders, right, to accommodate cyclists, things of that nature? So having those discussions around that. The conversation on e-mobility and e-bikes is a fascinating one. I will never forget, I live in the Grant Park neighborhood here in Atlanta. I woke up one morning, it was a Saturday morning, taking my dogs on a walk, and I walked to the park, and there was a pile of about 100 scooters just thrown into the park. And that was the introduction of bird scooters to Atlanta, as they essentially drove around with a bunch of trucks and just dropped them off on the roadside all around town. And if you look at it, it said, where do you ride these? Ride them in a bike lane. Like, well, what if there's not a bike lane? Can't ride it on the sidewalk. They say ride it in a bike lane. So then you get into that conversation. How do you accommodate that? What are the issues those things bring along? E-bikes that can travel very quickly, those sort of standalone one-wheel things that go, very quick. That interaction with pedestrians, those issues exist. It's all about trying to make the infrastructure work to accommodate that, but getting ahead of that is very difficult. So anyway, I covered a lot there, but I'd love for Ron to talk about his near miss stuff, because it's cool.
Sure. Yeah, you read my mind when I think of performance metrics, and this is less as a agency performance metric, but how we prioritize projects. Traditionally we've done this based on crash data, and like I said at the beginning of this, less than 1% of our total crashes, but almost 20% of our fatalities. So we're doing a new kind of method with conflict detection and kinetic energy models, which touches on something else that was brought up in the chat. So what we're trying to do is put out cameras and use AI to detect pedestrians and vehicles when they're having close interactions. Near misses is what they're commonly referred to as. I prefer conflict because it's not really nearly a miss, it's nearly a crash. But it's trying to gauge those higher speed conflicts when they're occurring and calculate the economic value of each conflict the same way we've historically calculated the economic dollar value of crashes. So we've leveraged some previous research and kind of have a really rough prediction model for kinetic that leverages kinetic energy and conflicts right now. We've taken some research from IT, and we're able to translate that into a benefit cost ratio, just like we've always done with crash data. So all those numbers that led from crashes to a dollar value and all the research that went into that years and years ago, there's new data out there now, such as conflicts, that we can try to get dollar values associated with that too, with new research. And it's not just conflicts, there's other data too. We have a variety of new big data sets from smartphones and God knows what else is being tracked, but we're getting all that data as well, and it's data we can use to help justify our projects. So really trying to figure that out now and how to use that data. I think the biggest challenge with those new data sets that we have, and I would love to see some research on this, by the way, would be trying to figure out how we can use that to big pedestrian data sets.
All right. Randy?
It's when I said it's crazy, it's just really hard. It's really hard because 300 pedestrian deaths is a lot, but it's still a relatively rare event given the exposures that we have, and same with 30 bicyclist deaths. So it's difficult to get to the causality. We've got a lot of information that are run from larger studies where you have activity data coupled that gives you some sense of exposure. But one of the things that was recommended in a report that we did a few years back that Kerry Watkins and Mike Rogers had the lead on was really doing a solid assessment of those incidences that did result in death and did result in serious injury. And kind of like, you look at helicopter crashes and you say, well, across all of these helicopter crashes, what were the factors that led to pilot death versus pilot injury versus no injury? And trying to do a better job of really case by case identifying those factors that we then need to collect data for. And so near miss could be the way that we do that. But there's sure an awful lot of near misses out there. And it seems like part of the factor is the driver paying attention, is the pedestrian paying attention, and being able to tease that out of the larger data is difficult. But it's something we need to face and we need to do with as much effort as we can.
Caitlin?
Sure. I'll actually just introduce another set of performance measures that I'm interested in. Those of you that are researchers, maybe you can run with this. This one's a little bit squishy. I think that perceived safety and comfort, especially when it comes to bicyclists and pedestrians, is really important. So how you feel when you're using a facility, or how you think you're going to feel when you're using it. And sometimes your perceived safety is really guiding your choices and the decisions you make as a roadway user. And I think it's important beyond level of traffic stress to kind of think about how users, not only how safe they are, but also how they feel while using facilities.
All right. Something I'm going to add in here, again, I'm going to go off script a little bit. Hopefully I don't get us in too much trouble. When we think about the performance metrics, I've heard a lot of mention of data that, particularly when you get into the safety data, the crash data, the injury data, it's just terrible on the pedestrian and cyclist side. It's vastly underreported. We all know that. And, so what do we do about that? But also the underreporting can be much greater with certain demographic groups, right? We know there are people who are much more hesitant to want to contact the police to report that they were in an incident. So you're going to find groups of VRUs who are much less likely to even be making our radar to know the issues there. And I'm sort of curious if there's any thoughts about really how do we address some of this data, and how do we address that there are different demographic groups who are more strongly impacted by this and maybe not being reported that they're more strongly impacted by this.
I've got a kind of a funny story to start off with that. The number one crash location for cyclists in the state of Georgia is on Georgia Tech's campus. Probably not because it's the least safe, but because you guys are very good at reporting those crashes. Chief Conway's out there are always ready to report them. So I always find that kind of a funny stat to share. But you're absolutely right. And what's even more concerning is we still see higher amounts of crashes in those higher, lower underserved communities. So despite the underreporting, we're still seeing those higher fatalities, higher severities. So one thing we've really been doing recently is incorporating the CDC Social Vulnerability Index into our performance metrics and helping us prioritize our projects based on that. One really good example of that is our systemic MARTA bus stop analysis. We use bus stop ridership and SVI, which is just a 0 to 1 scale. 0 meaning kind of affluent areas, and 1 meaning the most vulnerable areas with respect to different demographic data. Traditionally, that data set was used for where government should prioritize resources and emergency and natural disasters. But we did a study and found, well, it's correlated to severe injuries for pedestrians and cyclists as well. So we're utilizing that to help us predict crashes and get a more realistic value, even when the crashes weren't there, for whether we should prioritize investment in different crossings or roadway reconfigurations and hopefully more.
All right. I know we're coming up on time here, and I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. Safari, you could just skip to slide 8. Skip to the last slide. So I want to take one moment, just remind everybody. I'm going to ask the panelists all one last question. You can skip that one. We're going to run out of time. So go to the last slide, Safari. I'm going to ask the panel.
That was the last one.
Right. This is the last one. Yeah. So I'm going to ask the panel to think I'll give you a moment to think while I'm saying a couple other things, but what is the most important aspect of VRU safety that you'd like to leave this audience with? So as you take a moment to gather your thoughts, let me remind everybody that we do have the in-person research poster session coming up this Monday from 11 to 1 at One Georgia Center. I am hoping to see you there. This will be our 12th, that's fantastic. I didn't realize we've been doing it this long. I mean, that is, I think it's been a great experience, and it's been really helpful to help the researchers and the GDOT staff and everybody engage and really see what's going on. And I think both sides have really learned a lot. And also for the folks out there, remember that the RNS call is currently active, and the website was on the earlier slide. So I'm going to go in the reverse order that I started with. So Caitlin, what is your thought? What do you want to leave us with? What's the big message?
I hope that what you all will take away from this time together today is that vulnerable road user safety is not only important, it's ultimately essential to our roadway network. So in order to build these safe, equitable, and ultimately prosperous communities that we all hope for, you have to have alternative options for people to get the places they need to go, whether it's for recreation or essential trips. But I also hope to leave you with, this is a really exciting time to be a transportation professional, especially when working with vulnerable roadway users, just given the federal funding that's available, the technology that Ron and Andrew both touched on that GDOT is using. There's truly endless opportunities to make the networks, the research, and the projects better overall when we consider all roadway users.
Randy?
So I'm the guy who you put on a panel that's going to say, well, here's how much we don't know. We don't know all of these things, but there's still a lot of things that we do know. There's a lot of evidence out there that I think we can act on. And even though we might not be able to prioritize different mitigation measures, above the other, like we can with automobile mitigation measures, there's still a lot we can do. And, Ron mentioned the reducing speeds. I think I mentioned the line of sight, making sure that people are visible to each other, separating these modes where it's possible and practical. I think a little more work on the intersections. And, frankly, from a pedestrian perspective, there's still a lot we can do just by conforming with ADA requirements on road crossings. Let's make sure that the ramps and crosswalks are there, signals are working, and all of those kinds of things. And that's got to provide some help. And, it helped us to meet some of the other criteria as well.
Ron?
I'll leave with saying I want to be proactive as possible with safety assessments, but want to make sure we're remaining data driven in our practices and kind of making sure we're not getting emotion driven with doing programming projects. So any research topic related to that, I really encourage you guys to submit, whether it's using near miss technology, how we can more effectively do that. We have a big video detection system, which please use that we available for research projects. I'd love for you guys to use that. Whether it's new data sets and how to leverage that better, or anything else that you can think of on how to be proactive but data driven.
All right. And Andrew, take us home.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I just echoing what Randy and Caitlin said, that one, there's a lot we don't know, a lot of information we need, but there's a lot that we do, and there's a lot that can be done. It just takes the will to do that. I hope the biggest takeaway, though, and you've heard from myself and Ron, Georgia DOT is a very forward-looking agency in this space. We do a lot of work in this space. We've done a lot of projects, a lot of research, and we are up for tackling this challenge. So I'm excited about where we're headed, about some of the technologies we're using, some of the techniques we're using to tackle this challenge. We just got to get busy and get it done. So, and that's going to take all of you that are on this call, our partners in the academic space, our partners in industry. But we're looking forward to rising to the challenge. So thank you.
Well, again, I want to take a moment to thank everybody for attending the panel, and I really want to thank our panelists, Andrew, Ron, Randy, and Caitlin. It was fantastic. I learned a lot. We saw a lot of great comments. Also, the chat was very active, which is exciting. That tells us this is an interesting and important topic, and that people are passionate about it. So this has been great. This has been a wonderful panel. And I'm hoping we can continue this. We'll maybe get some webinars going on or some other things, and we're going to keep this discussion going and get doing a lot of important work. So again, thanks everybody for attending, and thanks again to the panel. Y'all were fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.